No, for the 100th time, nobody says they love the smell of napalm in the morning in this book. They haven't even invented napalm yet. Welcome, welcome, greetings all literature. Yes, the beating heart of this channel. My true love, alongside all those other things I love and am making videos about. But the main thrust of this channel. Today we will be discussing a 20th century classic, a remarkable little book by the name of Heart of Darkness. This is not it. I don't have my copy in Japan, okay? It's in London. So this is my stand-in. It's about the right length. Okay, hold on. Heart of Darkness. Okay. Perfect. I was going to use the Book of Mormon for comic effect, but I'd actually feel bad slapping it. No. So yes, anyway, Heart of Darkness was written by Joseph Conrad, who was born Joseph Korzeniowski, and this book is often considered one of the first modern masterpieces, though it neatly bridges 19th century realism and early modernism. That is to say, modernism that's on the early side, not things from the early modern period like Shakespeare and Marlowe and so on. Obviously, this was early modernism, not early modern writing. Clearly totally different things. You wait till you hear the confusion about Georgian poetry. Sheesh. Anyway, my rule was that if it were written within the last century, I'd probably call it a pop culture masterwork, because it's difficult to know what the canon will be many years from now. If we even still care about literary canons, you know, they're not very woke. Sorry, canon, you are a bit Eurocentric right now. But our little friend here was published in 1899. Ergo, I feel entirely comfortable having it in the series. Though, as we will see later, I do need to add a substantial caveat here. Purely in terms of its influence, I want to discuss Heart of Darkness as one of literature's great works. Now, Heart of Darkness tells the story of a funny-looking ginger kid named Andy as he battles shadow monsters with his plasma cannon. It was released on the PlayStation... Wait. Wrong Heart of Darkness. Get that out of here. Go on. Shoot. You see, it was a humorous misunderstanding. Only the highest quality of humour on this channel, I'm sure you would agree. No, here's the real story. Heart of Darkness was published in 1899 as a serial in Blackwood's magazine. And you may remember them from making Keats angry by calling him and his circle the Cockney School of Poetry. I bring that up mostly because I wanted to use my Angry Keats asset again. Look at him, it's beautiful. Conrad was at this point not a literary superstar, but had started to gain a reputation as a writer whose experience travelling the world allowed him to tell exciting stories of far-off lands. He had already published 3 novels, his debut, Almayr's Folly, set in Borneo, his second, An Outcast of the Islands, set in the jungle of Borneo's neighbouring island Sulawesi, and his third novel is about a voyage from Bombay to London, and you'll notice I don't list the title. That is correct. Problematic bell! Feel free to look it up yourself and you'll probably see why I don't want to say it. No getting cancelled for me before I have even started. No thank you. Let's move on swiftly. Let's talk about the story. Now, Heart of Darkness is not a long, detailed narrative. It's only considered a novella after all, and it was serialized in only 3 parts. And in my opinion, it's an odd little book. It is, despite its story within the story structure, fascinating more as a piece of craft than as a narrative tale, and gives the curious storytelling lesson of how realizing a character with minimal detail can make him seem rather than simple and uninteresting, enigmatic, powerful and complex. If we see very little of that character but hear a lot about them second-hand, that is. This novella revolves around the character of Kurtz, a man who runs an ivory trading post and has managed to arrange a kind of cult of personality in the midst of what was then the Congo Free State. But he is not our protagonist. He is the enigmatic figure our protagonist, Marlowe, is going to meet. Marlowe is something of an everyman character with a lust for exploration. Certainly he has a lot in common with Conrad himself. The first 2 chapters build up to these characters meeting, while the third shows what happens when they do. Which, to be honest, is not a whole lot. If anything, it's a big anticlimax. The final page is something of a letdown when we finally see this man who has influenced everything around him. We're told Kurtz is such an impressive man, but when we meet him, he is enfeebled by sickness and perhaps inspires more bewilderment than awe. We see less of him as a self-appointed demigod and more of him crawling around on the ground and dying with fear in his eyes and a cry that was no more than a breath. The horror, the horror. A lot about how Kurtz is built up is rather clever. We hear a lot more about him than we see, including quite cleverly the fact that his ideological beliefs have changed over time. So we don't know exactly what to think of him because we know he's mercurial and his beliefs change. His idealism about bringing civilization to a savage land has transformed into contempt and self-aggrandizement, and ultimately his thoughts become genocidal. This isn't a case of telling rather than showing, although there is a slight element of that. It's of being told a lot of things that you cannot trust, which is subtly different. Interesting though this is, however, ultimately I don't hold the story of Heart of Darkness in high esteem. It's not a very compelling narrative, to be honest. Basically, a man goes into the jungle, hears lots of rumours about the guy he's going to meet, then meets him, finds him to be sick, and then watches him die, leaving behind everything he built up. All of which is impressive only in its very specific and self-contained context. To be perfectly honest, and this will be true of many of the great works I cover, I don't actually particularly like Heart of Darkness, mostly because I find its narrative underwhelming. Helicopter. War flashback. Yes, I've seen it argued that the bathos is in fact intentional, that Kurtz being so unimpressive is the whole point of the story. He's been consumed by the darkness he brought with him. But even accepting that, this still isn't a very interesting narrative, and when that's all the novella really has to offer, a lot is built up and then surprise, we built up to nothing particularly compelling. That's just weak storytelling. And for me, it will forever prevent me from actually liking this book. But it certainly has other virtues, one of them being how the book is written. I fancy I had some vague notion of falling upon him and giving him a drubbing. I don't know. I had some imbecile thoughts. The knitting old woman with the cat obtruded herself upon my memory as a most improper person to be sitting at the other end of such an affair. You know, given that this was written before the 20th century even began, the naturalism that creeps into the dialogue, the clever similes, the interplay of colloquial speech and literary eloquence, it all seems so ahead of its time. Given when it was written, I really enjoyed the prose here. And yes, Conrad was a celebrated writer. I wrestled with him a lot during my thesis on war poetry, but prominent critic F.R. Leavis, in his book The Great Tradition, opens with, "The great English novelists are Jane Austen, George Eliot, Henry James, and Joseph Conrad." Though notably he didn't consider Heart of Darkness a good illustration of what Conrad could do, largely because of its ambiguities and lack of clarity. Now I will in future do other videos on what I and good old Frank actually agree on, that other Conrad books like Lord Jim are a fair bit better than Heart of Darkness. Probably one of the only things we could agree on. But Heart of Darkness is undoubtedly the most renowned and oft analysed work from Conrad's oeuvre, and is in other ways truly seminal. That the prose is so sprightly and memorable and clever is remarkable given that Conrad didn't even learn English until his teens. Ignore what Wikipedia tells you about it being in his 20s. You know, people often give Vladimir Nabokov too much credit for being able to write his absolutely peerless prose as someone whose mother tongue was Russian, but he grew up speaking English as well, and French too. Conrad's writing isn't up there with Nabokov's, at least as far as my taste goes, but it's a more remarkable achievement for him to have perfected English than the trilingual kid over there. Indeed, it's commonly held that because he had sensibilities that were shaped by having a different mother tongue, that's why he could write such innovative and unconventional prose for the time. Conrad, or Korzeniowski, was born in 1857 in what was then the Russian Empire, is now part of the Ukraine, but which had until 1793 been part of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. His father, Apollo, was also a literary man, and the family came from the Polish nobility. So even though he was not born in Poland, not even in what would now be called Poland, and Poland at the time didn't actually exist as a nation, his identity was strongly Polish. Apollo, Joseph's father, ardently wanted to see Poland restored, and his activism led to him being imprisoned and then exiled. Joseph's mother died when he was 7 and his father when he was 11. He lived with his uncle for 5 years before setting off to France to become a sailor, which at that young age seemed like a romantic life full of adventure to the young lad. He learned French to fluency and became a merchant seaman. Please don't chop up any part of that sentence to make it sound like I say something unpleasant. At 20, he joined the British Merchant Marine, where he stayed for 15 years, even briefly captaining a small bark. These experiences heavily influenced his future literary output. In 1890, a Belgian trading company hired him to go to the Congo. I don't think most people without a specific interest in the period think of Belgium much when they think of colonialism. But studying the period, or even looking into it fairly briefly, it's not uncommon to see Belgium represented as the worst of a bad bunch. At least the most brutal. This experience would form the basis for Heart of Darkness, with Kurtz likely being a composite of multiple infamous figures that Conrad either met or heard about at the time. Soon after, still a sailor, Conrad began to write in English. In 1894, unable to find more work on ships and becoming increasingly interested in writing, he devoted himself to his first novel, which was to be published without serialization in 1895. Heart of Darkness followed in 1899. The realism and believability of the reflections the narrator gives have an undeniable authenticity, which helps immensely when Marlowe begins to perceive things that seem unreal or draw comparisons with conceptions of hell or other infernal places. This really allows Marlowe's voice to be memorable, and to some extent to carry the mostly quite unimpressive narrative. How unique and unusual Conrad's literary voice is, and how modern it seems to readers in retrospect, is perhaps a major part of what makes Heart of Darkness a landmark work. Compared with the prose of, say, Dickens or Hardy, it's so agile and fun to read, unafraid of vernacular speech or sudden shifts in tone, not just in the dialogue, but in the authorial voice itself. I probably impressed this on you enough, but for the time that was quite impressive. As a matter of fact, though, it was not a particularly celebrated work at the time. It was read, certainly, but it wasn't a massive commercial or critical success, like, you know, Great Expectations, which it seems utterly bizarre to note was published in novel form just 38 years before this. One place its impact was quickly noticed was on T.S. Eliot's 1922 poem The Waste Land, which was a big part of why modernism turned English poetry on its head. There are notable thematic echoes, of course, but Eliot was for much of the drafting process going to use Kurtz's death as the opening quote for the poem, before Ezra Pound led him to question if Conrad was, in Pound's words, weighty enough. Eliot finally opted for Petronius instead, getting all the extra pretentious points by using a quote that required both Latin and classical Greek comprehension skills to even read. That's our T.S. Eliot. Thanks for kicking off the sequence of events that brought us the Cats movie, Tommy boy. So even if the trailblazing modernists didn't consider Conrad quite advanced enough to actually quote, at the very least the ideas and evocations he was propounding had a substantial literary influence. The writing itself is only one part of the reason this book has been so seminal though. Let's talk about the book's legacy. Heart of Darkness is one of the landmark texts when it comes to discussing colonialism. Conrad's status as an outsider, an exile, made his observations palatable to the contemporary readers. He was not British, but he was able to write in English about what was happening in Africa and the Far East, in a way that allowed them to reflect on events there. He was making observations about the effects of colonial presence, while talking about the Belgian part of Africa, putting a bit more distance between his intended readers and the people he was criticising. But criticising is what he was doing. Marlowe's thoughts at the start of the book, in the full knowledge of the entire story, are the conquest of the earth, which mostly means taking it away from those who have a different complexion or slightly flatter noses than ourselves, is not a pretty thing when you look into it too much. Understatement, perhaps, as we can judge from our modern perspective, but it is of course still an observation that ought to have been made. Conrad's position as in many ways an outsider figure has allowed academics to begin to frame him as what we call transnational. Professor Elika Boma at the University of Oxford notes how he was able to give expression to translated and transnational vision. Conrad is unambiguously critical of colonialism and the self-destructive greed and self-aggrandizement of the colonial figures he presents. Kurtz is enigmatic and draws the attention of those around him, sure, but ultimately he has destroyed himself, done untold harm to those around him, and functions as an allegory for people who have set themselves up in power in a place they don't belong. This is not an observation specifically on the English in Africa, though plenty of stories can be told of the harm the likes of Cecil Rhodes did there, nor is it specifically about the Belgians in the Congo. It's a broader observation, while at the same time being highly introspective. One way Kurtz being a lost cause already crumbling when we finally meet him works is as a criticism of a metonymical colonial system, even if I maintain that that doesn't make it a good story. Before we ring the progressive bell though, stop! I need to add that I used the word untold there for a reason. Transnational, certainly, but that doesn't mean universal. This book is not a dialogue between the colonial powers and the African people, as Professor Boma is certainly well aware. This is a cautionary tale, primarily about the harm the colonizers are inflicting on themselves, the folly of their actions, and the corruption they find within themselves in the heart of Africa, not from it. But that's the extent of it. It is emphatically not an expression of the actual people who are living in the land that is being exploited here. Heart of Darkness is not able to give voices to the African characters, considered savages by the Europeans. Marlowe is not a modern progressive voice, of course he isn't. True, he tends to objectify everyone he encounters, but the dehumanization of the local people is a matter of course here. The great Nigerian author Chinua Achebe is one of the most prominent voices in the literary criticism of Heart of Darkness. He called Conrad a thoroughgoing racist in his profoundly influential lecture on the book in 1975. He considered the descriptions of Africans Conrad gives to be assaults, and asks quite saliently, can nobody see the preposterous and perverse arrogance in thus reducing Africa to the role of props for the breakup of one petty European mind? Achebe's conclusion is that this shortcoming precludes the book from being called a great work of art. I can't really say I disagree with him. I mean, I don't want me labelling it here as a great work to be a contradiction to his conclusion, because it's a valid one. I don't necessarily agree with all of post-colonial commentary on the Western canon, which is something which I may inevitably have to discuss more and more as I talk about these great works. But there's no denying this huge shortcoming, even while simultaneously acknowledging that Conrad was, as the old chestnut goes, a product of his time. Thus the caveat at the beginning of this video. I consider Heart of Darkness a great work in one specific way: its influence, especially on the development of writing in English. In many ways it's a milestone in English literature and is both a fascinating read and a clever piece of craftsmanship, even acknowledging the shortcomings of its narrative as well as its wholly Eurocentric point of view. While they are very, very different pieces of writing, quite a lot of what I disliked about The Catcher in the Rye is also what I dislike here. Just like Holden Caulfield, Kurtz is a figure of fascination mostly because he can be whatever the reader wants him to be. Because so much is left ambiguous and so much is just inexplicable, it's very easy for these characters to be inchoate in the reader's minds, protean, and easy to squeeze into whatever mould the reader wants them to fit. Caulfield as the rebellious teenager, Kurtz as the tortured anti-hero. They're both left too open for me. I don't enjoy filling in those blanks when I can see them for what they are, or seeing the way others do so in a way I might find myself wholly disagreeing with. It's also why the Kurtz of Apocalypse Now, heavily based on this book, and if it wasn't clear, the reason I brought up Napalm at the start. You totally got that, obviously. It's why he's so memorable and powerful and completely different from the Kurtz of Heart of Darkness. As it stands, there are many problems with Heart of Darkness. Yes, certainly it could have been a lot less progressive, that's for sure. But it's still very much a one-sided observation, and young readers should be made aware of that limited perspective. Of course, it's quite difficult to imagine any writer at the time giving what we would consider a well-rounded and sensitively observed portrayal of colonial Africa. And you know, we do need to consider what the contemporary audience reaction to that would have been as well. That third novel I mentioned with the title I'm not going to bring up actually got a different title in America, not because they were censoring an offensive word, but because they thought nobody would buy a book that was about what seemed to be a non-white character. Part of what made the book a success in the first place, so that it would endure over these 100 years or so, was the evocation of the far-off, familiar, exotic land, peopled with objectified, dehumanized ideas of people. Which isn't to excuse that failing, of course, only to say it's hard to imagine an alternative. Though I suppose if Shakespeare hadn't written Othello, it would be very hard for me to imagine him writing something like that as well. Thus, purely in terms of its written style, the remarkable progressive and introspective elements it does have, and the influence it had on the subsequent development of English writing, I consider Heart of Darkness to be a great work. Okay, that's all for today. See you next time.